Baby, there you are.
I'm sorry, I think you have the wrong person.
I'd rehearsed my exit speech in the car for 20 minutes straight, and none of it prepared me for what happened next. A stranger crossed a ballroom full of 300 people, people who had spent a decade pretending I didn't exist, and called me baby in front of every single one of them. I want to ask you something before I tell you the rest. Where are you listening from right now? Are you driving home from a job that doesn't see you either? Folding laundry while somebody in another room makes you feel small without raising their voice? I ask because this story isn't really about a billionaire. It's about every person who ever sat quietly while a room decided they didn't matter, and then watched that room go completely silent when the truth finally arrived. Karma doesn't announce itself ahead of time. It just shows up wearing a different face than you expected, and by the time you recognize it, your whole life has already changed. My name is Talia Brennan. This is the story of how I went from standing alone by a drinks table, counting the minutes until I could leave my own high school reunion, to watching the same women who humiliated me forget how to speak. If you've ever been underestimated by people who were supposed to know you best, stay with me, because I promise you this one's worth the whole ride. And if this is your first time here, go ahead and hit subscribe, because we tell stories like this every week, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming. But let me start from the beginning, because none of it makes sense without it. I grew up in Charlotte, the oldest of three, raised by a mother who cleaned office buildings at night and still made it to every one of my school events with her uniform still on under her coat. I got into Whitfield Preparatory on a full academic scholarship when I was 14, and I walked through those doors believing something simple and a little bit foolish. I believed that if you worked hard enough, if you were kind enough, if you simply showed up as the best version of yourself, people would eventually see you. I believed effort was a language everybody understood. I was wrong about that, but it took me years to admit it. At 17, I had a list taped inside my closet door, the kind of list a hopeful teenager keeps. Find people who choose you back. Build something nobody can take from you. Never let anyone make you small enough to fit in their pocket. I believed in those words the way some people believe in scripture. I was generous with my time, my notes, my lunch money when somebody forgot theirs. I gave people the benefit of the doubt long after they'd stopped earning it. There was a girl in my class named Brielle Castellan. Old Charlotte money, the kind of family with a wing of the library named after them. Brielle had a way of saying things that sounded like compliments until you got home and replayed them in your head and realized they weren't. I didn't understand yet that some people only feel tall when they've found someone to stand on. There was also a boy, Julian Cross. He used to wait for me by the science building every morning, and for a few months during junior year, I let myself believe that meant something permanent. I didn't know yet how easily a boy like that could let go of a girl like me the moment it became inconvenient. And there was one more detail, small, almost forgettable, that I didn't think twice about for 11 years. A rainy October evening on a trip I almost didn't take. A stranger I sat with for 40 minutes and then never saw again. I didn't get his name. I didn't think I needed to. I had no idea that single evening would walk back into my life wearing a tailored suit and change everything in front of everyone who ever made me feel like I was too much and not enough at the same time. I almost didn't go to that reunion. 3 days before, I stood in my closet staring at a dress, listening to a voice in my chest that kept saying one thing: don't go. I went anyway. And that decision was about to cost me everything I thought I understood about who I was, before it gave me back more than I ever imagined possible. Whitfield Preparatory had a particular kind of silence reserved for scholarship kids. Nobody said anything cruel out loud, not at first. It was quieter than that. It was being the only one not invited to a sleepover that everyone else discussed in the hallway the next morning like it was common knowledge. It was group projects where my name ended up on the final slide in smaller font. Brielle Castellan figured out how to use that silence as a weapon long before I understood it was happening. She was the kind of pretty that came with an instruction manual nobody handed me. Soft blonde hair, a laugh that carried exactly as far as she wanted it to, and two girls who orbited her like she was the only sun worth circling, Devon Marsh and Priya Okafor. Devon agreed with everything Brielle said before Brielle finished saying it. Priya was sharper, the kind of sharp that noticed things, and for a while I thought that meant she might be different. She wasn't, not when it counted. In the beginning, Brielle was almost warm to me. Sophomore year, she sat next to me in chemistry and asked to copy my notes, and when I gave them to her without hesitation, she looked at me like I'd done something strange. "You really don't mind?" she asked. "Why would I mind? You needed them." She studied me for a second too long, like she was trying to find the angle, the thing I wanted in return. When she realized there wasn't one, something in her expression shifted. I didn't understand at the time that I'd just told her something important about myself. I'd told her I could be used without complaint. It started small. She'd ask favors and never return them. She'd invite everyone to something in a conversation I was technically standing inside of, and somehow my invitation never came. When I brought it up once, gently, she laughed and called me sensitive, and somehow I ended up apologizing. That was the pattern. She'd take something from me and hand me back the bill for noticing. Julian was different, or I thought he was. He played soccer, he was polite to teachers, he had the kind of easy popularity that didn't seem to require cruelty to maintain. We started talking junior year over a shared physics class, and for a few months, he made Whitfield feel survivable. He'd save me a seat, he'd walk me to my mother's car some afternoons, and he never once acted like that was something to be embarrassed about. I let myself hope. I want to be honest about that, because I think hope gets a bad reputation in stories like this, like it was foolish to feel it. It wasn't foolish. It was human. I was 17, and someone was choosing me, actively, in front of people who usually looked through me, and I held on to that feeling with both hands. Brielle noticed. Brielle always noticed things that threatened her position at the center of every room. I didn't see the conversation that changed things. I only saw the result. Julian stopped waiting by the science building. He stopped saving the seat. When I asked him directly, because by then I'd learned that vague hurt feelings got you nowhere with people like him, he gave me an answer that still sits somewhere in my chest all these years later. "It's getting complicated," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "With the group and everything, you understand." I understood exactly what he meant, and exactly who had decided it for him. I just didn't have proof, and without proof, there was nothing to argue with. That was Brielle's particular skill. She never left fingerprints. The worst part wasn't losing Julian. The worst part was realizing that an entire social ecosystem had reorganized itself to make space for my exclusion, smoothly, without a single raised voice, like clearing a table after dinner. Nobody apologized because nobody believed they'd done anything. That's the quiet cruelty nobody warns you about. The people doing it never think of themselves as the villain. They think of themselves as simply choosing comfort, and you happen to be what's outside it. I graduated and told myself I was done needing rooms like that to want me. I built a life designed to prove it. I just didn't know yet how far that proof would need to travel before anyone believed it. I left Charlotte for college on a scholarship that covered tuition but nothing else, which meant I spent 4 years working 2 jobs while my classmates spent their breaks in places with names I'd only seen in magazines. I studied architecture because I'd spent my whole childhood watching my mother come home exhausted from cleaning buildings she'd never be allowed to design, and something in me decided I wanted to be the one drawing the blueprints instead. By 26, I had my own small firm in Atlanta, 3 employees, a waiting list of clients, and a level of financial stability my 17-year-old self would have considered impossible. I want to be clear about that, because what happened at the reunion wasn't about insecurity over my accomplishments. I knew what I'd built. The wound was older than that. It wasn't about whether I'd succeeded. It was about whether the people who decided I didn't belong would ever have to know they were wrong. That's a different kind of hunger, and it's a dangerous one, because it makes you walk back into rooms you have no real reason to enter. The reunion invitation came through email in March, glossy and corporate, the kind designed by an event committee that included, predictably, Brielle Castellan. I almost deleted it. My thumb hovered over the trash icon for a full 10 seconds before I closed the email instead and let it sit, unanswered, for 6 weeks. My best friend Renata was the one who eventually talked me into it, though talked isn't quite the right word. She simply refused to let the conversation end any other way. "You've spent 10 years building a life those people don't know exists," she said over dinner one night in May. "Don't you want to walk into a room and let them see it for 5 minutes? Just 5 minutes, Talia. Then you never have to think about Whitfield again." I told her I didn't need their approval. She told me that wasn't the point, that closure and approval weren't the same thing, that sometimes you have to stand in a doorway you once got pushed out of just to prove to yourself you can walk through it on your own terms. I bought the dress 2 weeks later. Deep emerald, fitted, the kind of dress that made me feel like the woman I'd become instead of the girl I used to be. There's one more piece of this I have to give you now, because it matters more than anything else that happened before the reunion, and I didn't understand its weight until much later. 11 months before that night, I'd taken a work trip to Seoul for an international design conference, the first time my firm had been invited to present internationally. It rained for 3 straight days, the kind of cold rain that gets into your jacket no matter how good the jacket is. On my last evening there, walking back from a closed shop where I'd stopped to buy an umbrella, I passed a man sitting alone on a set of stone steps outside a shuttered pharmacy. He wasn't doing anything dramatic. He was just sitting there, elbows on his knees, staring at the wet pavement like it had personally wronged him. I almost kept walking. I want to be honest about that too, because kindness in a story like this can start to sound inevitable, like it was always going to happen, and it wasn't. I almost walked past him, the way you walk past 100 strangers a day. Something stopped me. Maybe it was the stillness in him, the specific kind of stillness that comes from a person who has simply run out of reasons to move. I sat down a few feet away and asked, in the careful, overly polite tourist Korean I'd practiced for the trip, if he was all right. He looked startled that anyone had asked. We ended up talking for almost an hour, mostly in English, about nothing important. The buildings around us, the street food he recommended 2 blocks over, what it felt like to be far from home even when home was complicated. He was coughing, so I went into a convenience store and came back with hot tea and lozenges I more or less forced into his hands. When the rain refused to let up, I gave him my umbrella because I had a 15-minute walk, and he looked like he had nowhere urgent to be and every reason to want shelter more than I did. I never asked his name. He never offered it. When the rain finally thinned, I said goodbye, told him to take care of himself, and walked back to my hotel without a single thought that the conversation mattered beyond that hour. I flew home 3 days later and didn't think about him again. Not once, not for 11 months. I had no idea that somewhere on the other side of the world, a man was about to turn an entire company's worth of resources toward finding a woman whose name he only knew from a coffee cup, and that the search would end in a ballroom in Atlanta on the exact night I'd almost talked myself out of attending. The ballroom at the Ashbourne Hotel looked exactly like I imagined it would, all warm light and rented elegance. 300 adults in expensive clothes performing happiness at each other across a room full of catered hors d'oeuvres. I stood near the drinks table for the better part of an hour, nursing a glass of wine I wasn't really drinking, watching my old classmates hug each other with the specific intensity of people who hadn't thought about each other in a decade and wanted everyone to believe otherwise. I'd sent Renata a voice note 20 minutes in. Coming here was a mistake. Call me in 45 minutes and invent an emergency. She wrote back almost instantly. I'll call, but give it an hour first. You drove 2 hours for this. Let them see you. I didn't get the full hour. I felt them before I saw them. That particular shift in the air that happens when people who used to control your sense of safety start moving toward you with purpose. Brielle led, blonde and polished in a way that looked effortless, and definitely wasn't, with Devon trailing slightly behind her and Priya bringing up the rear, hanging back just enough to suggest she hadn't fully committed to whatever was about to happen. Talia. Brielle said my name like she was testing whether it still worked. I genuinely didn't think you'd come. Good to see you, Brielle. You look incredible. Doesn't she look incredible? This to Devon, who agreed immediately, the way Devon agreed with everything. The questions started the way they always start at these things. Soft, conversational, almost kind on the surface. What was I doing now? Was I still in Atlanta? And then, inevitably, delivered with a smile that made the question impossible to push back against without looking oversensitive. Are you seeing anyone? Not currently, I said, and reached for my glass. Oh! Brielle's eyebrows lifted exactly enough to register the answer without committing to an expression. Kids? No. I said nothing, because I understood exactly what was happening. This wasn't conversation. This was inventory. The kind these women had been taking of me since I was 14 years old, except now they were dressed up as concern instead of cruelty, which somehow made it worse. Then Brielle said the thing I think she'd been waiting all evening to say, glancing around the room first like she was about to share something generous instead of something designed to cut. You know, I always thought you intimidated men a little, back at Whitfield. You had this energy like you didn't need anyone. It's not a criticism. It's just men want to feel needed, and you've always seemed so self-sufficient. I kept my face still. I'd had 11 years of practice keeping my face still around exactly this kind of sentence. What none of them knew, what Brielle would have denied with her whole chest, was that the isolation she was so gently diagnosing in me had been built by her, deliberately, over 4 years, one quiet exclusion at a time. She was standing in front of me, in a dress that cost more than my mother used to make in a month, calling the wound she'd personally created a personality flaw. Maybe, I said, and my voice came out almost amused, which felt like its own small victory. And then, because the evening apparently had a sense of theater, I heard a voice from the entrance that I hadn't heard in over a decade. Julian! He walked in with the same easy confidence I remembered, like the room owed him a welcome and always had. On his arm was a woman with auburn hair and a smile built for exactly this kind of room. His eyes found mine almost instantly, the way eyes do when they're looking for the one person they're hoping not to see. Talia. Wow. He said my name like it surprised him. This is Marisol, my fiancé. Marisol shook my hand warmly, eyes doing a quick assessment that lasted under 2 seconds and would never be acknowledged out loud. Oh. You two know each other? Did you date? Briefly, Julian said, with the specific casualness of a man minimizing something that had been neither brief nor casual to the 17-year-old girl standing in front of him now. Small world, Marisol said pleasantly, and turned back to him like a flower finding the sun. And just like that, I stopped existing in whatever orbit they were standing in. I gave it exactly 4 seconds. Then I set my glass down, smiled at no one in particular, and walked toward the restroom with the kind of deliberate calm that takes everything you have. I made it inside before the first tear fell. I stood at the sink, both hands flat against the marble, and looked at a woman whose makeup was still perfect, while something old and ragged tore quietly open in her chest. My phone buzzed. Renata, early, like she'd felt it from 2 hours away. I almost answered. I almost took the exit I'd built for myself. Instead, I pressed a tissue under each eye, took one long breath, and pushed the door open, telling myself I'd collect my coat and leave with whatever dignity I had left. The room had changed while I was gone. I felt it before I understood it. A shift in the air, conversations dropping into whispers, heads turning toward the entrance. A hotel staff member near the front was speaking fast into an earpiece, his posture rigid with the particular anxiety of someone whose evening had just become more complicated than he was prepared for. "Who is that?" someone near me murmured. "Some Korean investor," a man in a gray suit answered, craning his neck. "I heard his group just closed a deal downtown. Real estate. Hundreds of millions." I didn't turn around right away. I had no reason to think any of it had anything to do with me. I was wrong, and I was about to find out exactly how wrong in front of every single person who had ever made me feel like I didn't belong in a room like this one. The doors at the far end of the ballroom opened, and a man in a black suit walked in like the room had been waiting for him without knowing it. I want to try to describe what that looked like, because it wasn't loud and it wasn't dramatic in any way I could point to directly. He didn't move fast. He didn't need to. The room simply reorganized itself around him, conversations thinning into silence as he crossed it, two quiet men trailing a measured distance behind him. He had the kind of stillness that made everyone else's performance of confidence look exactly like what it was. A performance. The hotel's general manager intercepted him near the center of the room, hand extended, already talking fast. The man shook his hand, said something brief in response, and then, in a moment the room would replay in conversation for the rest of the night. He simply stopped listening. His eyes had found something across the ballroom, and the general manager kept talking to a man who was no longer there, in any way that mattered. I watched it happen the way everyone else was watching it happen, with the detached curiosity of a bystander, right up until I realized he wasn't looking at the room anymore. He was looking at me! I glanced over my shoulder, certain there had to be someone behind me, someone who made more sense as the answer to that gaze. There was a wall. There was a flower arrangement. There was nothing else. He started walking, and the crowd parted the way crowds part for people who move with absolute purpose. He walked past Brielle, who had positioned herself near the center, specifically because the center is where important things happen, and I watched her register, in real time, that he was not walking toward her at all. He stopped in front of me, close enough that I could see his expression wasn't as composed as it had looked from across the room. There was something underneath it, warm and a little uncertain, like he was confirming something he'd been hoping was true for a long time. His hand came to rest at my waist, gently, like it already knew where it belonged. "Baby," he said, quiet enough that it was meant only for me, except the silence around us was wide enough that everyone heard it anyway. "There you are." The room went still in the specific electric way of 300 people witnessing the same impossible thing at once. "What?" was all I managed. "You stopped replying to me," he said. Somewhere behind him, I heard a champagne glass set down on a table harder than it needed to be. I kept my voice low, because I would not give this room the second humiliation of watching me unravel twice in one night. "I think you have the wrong person." Something moved at the edge of his composure, not quite a smile. "Talia Brennan, architect. Full scholarship to your university. You run a firm in Atlanta with 3 employees and a waiting list. You were in Seoul 11 months ago, in October. It rained for 3 days." He paused. "I don't have the wrong person." Seoul. The word turned over slowly in my mind, like a key finding a lock I hadn't realized was there. Gray skies, damp cold. A man on stone steps outside a shuttered pharmacy, coughing, staring at wet pavement like it owed him something. "That was you," I said, barely a whisper. "That was me," he said. "I've been looking for you for 11 months. My name is Jun-Hae Sung." Brielle materialized at his elbow before I could respond, the practiced smoothness of a woman who'd been interrupting conversations her whole life and never once acknowledged it. "I'm so sorry to interrupt. I don't think we've been introduced. Brielle Castellan. My husband and I actually have significant investment interests, and I'd love to—" "Did you eat yet?" he asked, and he wasn't looking at Brielle when he said it. He was looking at me, and the question had no subtext at all. It simply wanted an answer. Brielle's extended hand hung in the air a second too long before she lowered it. No, I said. I haven't. He gestured toward a quiet table at the edge of the room, away from the crowd. Not a command, an invitation, offered by a man who already suspected the answer, but would have accepted a different one anyway. I went. We sat at the small table, while the rest of the ballroom tried, and failed, to pretend it wasn't watching us. A server appeared with water, and vanished just as quickly. Hae-sung turned toward me with the kind of unhurried attention that made it feel like there was nowhere else in the world he needed to be. Ask me, he said. Ask you what? Whatever question is sitting behind your eyes right now. I had several. I started with the one that felt safest. How do you know all of that about me? My firm, my scholarship, soul? I had people looking for you for 4 months, he said. No embarrassment in it at all. Like it was simply a fact that required no defense. I only had your name from a coffee cup. It took longer than I expected. You searched for me because of a coffee order? I searched for you, he said, because for 40 minutes in the rain, a stranger treated me like a person instead of a transaction. I'd spent my entire adult life surrounded by people who wanted something from me. My money, my approval, my name attached to their projects. You didn't know who I was. You gave me your umbrella and a cup of tea, and never once asked for anything back. I'd forgotten that kind of evening existed. I wasn't willing to let it go without trying to find you. I thought about that night differently now, layering the memory of the man on those wet steps over the man sitting across from me in a suit that probably cost more than my first car. The eyes were the same. That was the part that gave him away, even now. The particular weight behind them, like he was still carrying something heavy and had simply gotten better at not showing it. You were sick that night, I said. You kept saying it was nothing. It wasn't nothing. I'd come from a meeting with my board that afternoon. There'd been a betrayal, someone in my own family, and I'd walked out of that building and just kept walking for hours without any real plan to stop. He looked at his hands for a moment. I wasn't in a good place. You sat down next to me anyway. I'm glad I did, I said, and meant it more than I expected to. So am I. I asked him why he hadn't simply called, if his people had found me. His answer landed somewhere I wasn't ready for. I did call. 3 times. I thought of the string of unfamiliar international numbers I'd declined over the past several months. Ruthless, the way you get after enough spam calls retrain your instincts. I didn't know it was you. I'm sorry. I know. So I decided to come instead. It was around then that I noticed Brielle hadn't actually left the area. She'd retreated only as far as necessary to look like she wasn't listening, and she'd brought Devon and Priya with her, the 3 of them arranged in a loose half-circle that pretended to be casual conversation. I watched Brielle's expression cycle through something I hadn't seen on her before. Not just curiosity, calculation. I would learn later, though not that night, exactly what was sitting underneath that calculation. Brielle's husband Garrett, a cardiac surgeon with a taste for real estate he didn't fully understand, had sunk 18 months and most of their savings into a downtown development that was quietly dying for lack of an anchor investor. They'd been chasing a meeting with exactly the kind of Korean investment group that didn't take meetings with people like Garrett. Brielle didn't know his name yet. She only knew, the way she'd always known things, that he was important enough to matter, and that mattering to him might fix a problem she hadn't told anyone she had. She approached again, smoother this time, more prepared. I'm so sorry to interrupt again. I just wanted to say, my husband and I are actually deeply involved in a development downtown that I believe your group has been reviewing. We would absolutely love to have you for dinner while you're in town. Brielle, Hae-sung said. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It carried the exact quality of a door closing, unhurried, and completely final. I heard what you said to her earlier tonight, about why she's alone, about men not wanting women who don't need them. The color shifted in Brielle's face. Devin went very still. Priya looked at the floor. I traveled a long way to find this woman, he continued. I had people searching for 4 months. I called her 3 times before I decided to come here myself. He let that settle before he kept going. So I'd like you to understand that you were wrong about everything you said to her tonight. Every word of it. And regarding the development, I reviewed your husband's proposal this morning. Before I knew any of you would be in this room, I declined it. That decision had nothing to do with tonight. But I won't pretend that anything I've seen here has changed my mind. Brielle opened her mouth. Nothing came out. For what might have been the first time in her adult life, there was no reframe available to her, no charm offensive that could reach this particular moment. She turned and walked away without another word. Devin followed immediately. Priya hesitated, just for a second. Long enough that I wondered if she'd say something. She didn't. But the look on her face, just before she turned, wasn't triumph or embarrassment. It looked almost like shame, the kind that had been sitting under the surface for longer than tonight. I looked back at Hae-sung. You didn't have to do that. I know, he said. I wanted to. For a moment after Brielle walked away, I just sat there, trying to catch up to everything that had happened in the span of about 6 minutes. 11 years of carrying a particular story about myself. The scholarship girl who tried too hard. The one who intimidated men by simply existing without apology. And all of it had just been quietly dismantled by a man who hadn't raised his voice once. You're allowed to be angry at them, Hae-sung said, watching my face. You don't have to perform being fine for my benefit. That undid something in me more than the confrontation itself had. Nobody had ever told me that before. Not in so many words. Not my mother, who'd taught me to keep my chin up because there was no other option available to her. Not Renata, who loved me fiercely but mostly by helping me laugh past the hurt rather than sit inside it. I think I've been performing fine for so long I forgot there was another option, I admitted. He didn't try to fix that sentence. He just let it exist between us for a moment, which I was starting to understand was something he did on purpose. He didn't fill silences out of discomfort. He let them sit until they'd said what they needed to say. Can I tell you something honest? I asked. I'd prefer it. I almost left tonight, twice. Once before I even got out of my car, and once about 10 minutes before you walked in. I've spent so long telling myself I didn't need anyone in this room to see me clearly. And then the second they made me feel small again, it was like no time had passed at all. Like I was still 17. That's not weakness, he said. That's what happens when a wound doesn't get the chance to heal. It doesn't mean you're still that girl. It means nobody ever apologized to her. I felt something shift in my chest. The kind of shift that doesn't have a clean name. Not relief exactly. Recognition, maybe. The sense of being accurately seen by someone for the first time in longer than I wanted to admit out loud. Why didn't you just message me when you found my information? I asked. 4 months of searching, and then what? You booked a flight instead of sending an email? I considered it, he said. And for the first time all night, something almost shy crossed his face. I rehearsed several versions on the plane. None of them were good. I kept imagining a stranger's name showing up in your inbox, and you deleting it without a second thought. And the idea of being one more person you had to filter out felt worse than the risk of coming here and being wrong. You weren't wrong. No, he agreed. I wasn't. Across the room, I caught Julian watching us. His expression difficult to read at first, and then not difficult at all once I let myself actually look at it. Not jealousy, not quite. Something smaller and sadder. Regret. The specific kind that arrives when a person realizes a choice they made carelessly years ago is finally being billed to them in full, with interest. He held my gaze for a second too long, and then looked away first. He'd let go of my hand in a school hallway 11 years ago because it had been easy and convenient at the time. He didn't have any claim to my attention now, And somewhere underneath the regret on his face, I think he understood that. I turned back to Hae-sung. What happens now? You fly back to Seoul tomorrow and this becomes a strange story you tell people at dinner parties? No, he said, simply. Now I ask you to leave this room with me, and we figure out everything else after that. I'm not interested in tonight being the whole story. I'm interested in finding out what the rest of it looks like, if you're willing to let me. I looked around the ballroom slowly, at the people who'd watched me stand alone 2 hours earlier, at the faces that had taken quiet satisfaction in being on the comfortable side of my humiliation. None of them mattered the way they used to. I could feel that shift happening in real time, like a weight I'd been carrying so long I'd forgotten it had a shape finally setting itself down. I thought about the girl who'd stood in her closet 3 days ago, listening to a voice that said, "Don't go," and chosen to come anyway, because some stubborn, tender part of her still believed she deserved to take up space in rooms that once made her feel small. I stood up. I took his hand. We didn't leave immediately. I want to tell you why, because it surprised me too. As we stood up from the table, the general manager reappeared, flustered and apologetic, asking if Mr. Jun would like a private room arranged, away from the crowd that was now openly staring. Hae-sung glanced at me first, an unspoken question, and I found myself shaking my head. "No," I said. "I'd actually like to stay a little longer." He studied me for a moment, then nodded once, like he understood exactly what I was choosing, and respected it enough not to talk me out of it. I'd spent 10 years avoiding rooms like this one, building a life far enough away from Whitfield Preparatory that I never had to test whether I'd actually healed or just gotten good at distance. Standing there, with his hand still loosely around mine, I realized I didn't want to leave through a side door like I had something to hide. I wanted to walk out the front, past every person who'd ever made me feel like an inconvenience, on my own terms. We crossed the room slowly, and conversations dimmed as we passed, the way they do when people are trying to overhear something while pretending they aren't. Julian intercepted us near the bar, Marisol a few steps behind him, her expression caught somewhere between curiosity and confusion. "Talia," he said, "can I talk to you for a second?" Hae-sung's grip on my hand loosened, a quiet signal that the choice was entirely mine. I appreciated that more than I could say in the moment. "You have about 30 seconds, I told Julian. He looked thrown by that, like he'd expected either anger or forgiveness, and hadn't prepared for the flat, unimpressed calm I was actually offering him. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry, for how things ended, for not standing up for you when it mattered." He glanced briefly at Hae-sung, then back at me. "I was a coward back then. I think I've always known that." "You were," I said. "Thank you for finally saying it out loud." It wasn't a dramatic moment. I didn't cry, and I didn't feel the urge to make him feel better about his own guilt, which is what I would have done at 17, or even at 25. I just let the apology exist, accepted it for what it was, an acknowledgement 11 years late, and let him go back to his fiancée without offering him anything more than that. Near the windows, Brielle was standing very still with a champagne glass she appeared to have forgotten she was holding. Devon had her hand on Brielle's arm in the universal posture of damage control. As we passed, Brielle's eyes met mine for just a second, and for the first time in our entire shared history, I watched her search for something to say and come up with absolutely nothing. I didn't stop. I didn't need to say anything else to her. Hae-sung had already said everything that needed saying, and watching her stand there with nothing left in her arsenal was its own kind of closure I hadn't realized I needed until it was happening. It was Priya who caught up to us at the edge of the room, slightly out of breath, like she'd had to work up the nerve. "Talia, wait." She glanced at Hae-sung, then back at me, and lowered her voice. "I just wanted to say something, for what it's worth. You were always the smartest person in any room we put you in. I think some part of all of us knew that. That was the actual problem. I'm sorry it took me this long to say it." I looked at her for a long moment. It wasn't the apology I'd spent a decade imagining receiving, and it didn't erase 4 years of silent complicity, but it was honest, and it had clearly cost her something to say it, and I found I had room to accept that for what it was without needing it to be more. "Thank you, Priya," I said, and meant it. She nodded, eyes a little wet, and stepped back into the crowd. We made it almost to the doors when the hotel's events coordinator stopped us one final time, asking, with poorly disguised excitement, whether Mr. June would consider a brief word for the alumni newsletter regarding his connection to the school. Hae-sung looked at me, a question in his eyes about whether I wanted any part of that kind of spotlight. "Just one thing," I said, turning to the small cluster of classmates now openly listening. "I worked for everything I have. Nobody gave me a single thing in this room 11 years ago, and nobody's giving me anything tonight either. I just stopped needing your approval to know my own worth. That's all this is." It wasn't a long speech. It didn't need to be. I watched it land across the faces of people who'd spent 4 years deciding I didn't belong among them, and I felt the truth of it settle into my own chest at the same time it settled into theirs. Outside, the night air felt clean in a way the ballroom hadn't. Cars waited at the curb, the kind of quiet, expensive efficiency that surrounded a man like Hae-sung wherever he went. He opened the door for me himself, waving off the driver who moved to do it. "I rehearsed an entire speech for tonight," he admitted, before I climbed in. 13 hours on the plane, going over what I'd say if I found you. None of it was baby. There you are. No? No. I saw you across the room, and the plan stopped mattering. I laughed. The first real laugh of the entire evening, unguarded and a little disbelieving at my own life. I didn't look back at the hotel as the car pulled away. I'd spent 10 years giving rooms like that one far more power over my sense of self than they ever deserved, and for the first time, I understood exactly how much that was about to change. I won't pretend the rest of it happened overnight, because that wouldn't be honest, and honesty is the only reason this story is worth telling at all. Hae-sung stayed in Atlanta for a week after the reunion, instead of the 2 days he'd originally planned. We had dinner at a quiet Korean restaurant in Buckhead that he swore was the closest thing to home cooking he'd found in the city, and somewhere between the first conversation and the fourth, I stopped waiting for the catch. "There wasn't one!" he called when he said he would owe. He showed up when he said he would word. After 11 years of measuring affection by what people quietly withheld, it took me a while to trust a man who simply gave what he said he'd give, without conditions attached. We spent the next year building something slowly, across an ocean and several time zones, more video calls than either of us would publicly admit to, and more long flights than either of our calendars technically allowed. My firm grew during that time too, not because of him, but because I finally stopped shrinking my ambition to fit a room that was never going to make space for it on its own. We picked up 2 commercial projects that I'd have considered out of reach a year earlier, and I hired 2 more architects, both women who reminded me a little of myself at 23, hungry and underestimated, and ready to prove something to nobody but themselves. As for the reunion itself, word travels in small social circles the way it always does. I heard, through Renata, who heard it through someone else, that Brielle and Garrett's development downtown folded within the year, the investment they'd been counting on never materializing from any direction. I felt less satisfaction in that than I expected to. By then, I'd already gotten the thing I actually needed, which had nothing to do with Brielle's downfall, and everything to do with finally believing my own worth, without requiring her ruin as proof of it. Priya reached out again, a few months later. A real conversation this time, not just an apology delivered in passing at a party. We're not close, not in any deep way, but we talk sometimes, and I think that's enough. Not every relationship needs to be repaired completely to be worth keeping a door open for. Julian, I never heard from again, and I found I didn't mind that at all. Hae-sung proposed 18 months after that night, Not in some elaborate spectacle, but quietly, in my own apartment, on an ordinary Tuesday, because he said he didn't want the moment competing with anything else for my attention. I said yes before he finished the sentence, which made him laugh in a way I'd come to recognize as entirely unguarded, the same laugh from the man on the pharmacy steps who'd looked startled that anyone had stopped to sit beside him. We got married the following spring. Small, just the people who actually mattered. My mother crying through the entire ceremony in the front row. Renata stood beside me the whole time, the way she'd stood beside me through every version of this story, long before there was anything good to celebrate. I think about that reunion sometimes, not with anger anymore, but with something closer to gratitude. I almost didn't go. I want you to sit with that for a second, because I think it's the actual lesson underneath all of this. I almost let a decade-old fear keep me out of a room I had every right to walk into. If I'd listened to that voice telling me to stay home, I'd have missed the night that changed everything, and I'd never have known how close I came to missing it. So if there's a room you've been avoiding because of who you used to be inside it, I'd ask you to consider walking back in anyway. Not for the people who hurt you, but for yourself. You might not find a billionaire waiting on the other side of that decision. Most of us won't, and that's all right. But you might find out exactly how far you've actually come, and sometimes that's worth more than anything else the room could possibly offer you. Thank you for sitting through this one with me. If this story meant something to you, if any part of Talia's journey felt like your own, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Tell me which moment got you the most. And if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe, because we've got another story coming next week that I think you're going to need just as much as this one. Until then, take care of yourselves. And remember, the room that once made you feel small was never as big as you thought it was.